All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So my name is Serena. I am your host for the Pendulum. Hi, Lori. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Good, good.
All right, let me share my screen and then we will get started on today's topic. And so this is kind of a continuation of what I talked about before. Since I didn't get a chance to finish it, so I wanted to make sure that, I was able to finish the last two levels. But this is the end of Stress Awareness Month. And so I want to spend a few minutes also talking about the stress recovery. That is one piece of the stress process that we don't often hear about or talk about. And I think it deserves some attention because it's an important component. I mean, recovery in general is important, and yet we don't really apply it to stress. And yet it's so essential. And I'm going to show you why it's essential. So to kind of just go back over these definitions, which now I have the most accurate definitions that I didn't have last time, recognizing, what stress is, of course, so stress is, this adaptation that we go through, this adjustment, how we accommodate to any kind of perceived or real threat or demand. And these can be internal threats or demands, a perception that we have, that something is threatening us or being demanding upon our resources or our time, our energy, our effort. It doesn't matter what that kind of demand is, but it's something that we feel or believe or perceive as being a demand. Or it could be an external one. And then when we talk about prevention, we're really looking at, how do we stop something from happening? So preventing, you hear a lot about heart disease prevention, depression screenings for prevention, those kinds of things. And management is controlling things, dealing with whatever symptoms are present. So when you have these stress symptoms that are present for you, how do you manage them so that they don't escalate? Because they are going to be present. And oftentimes, if they feel like they're starting to escalate into more of the distressing types of symptoms, that's when we want to be able to, kind of reduce them or manage them so that they're more in our control and less out of our control. And then being able to just give ourselves that ability to feel like, we are able to do something about this. And then reducing, reduction with stress reduction, it is making something a little bit less in the degree that we experience it or the amount or size. So think about it like in terms of intensity. We're reducing the intensity of something that we're experiencing. So it doesn't mean that we're actually letting it go away or making it going away or we're eliminating it. We're just, instead of experiencing like a very intense emotion, for example, maybe we're reducing that intensity from like a rage to a tolerable anger level, or something of that nature. And then, of course, recovery is returning to a normal state of health, mind, or strength. And so these are the different definitions, that we're working with when we're talking about this model, that I've talked about before. And so just to review, it really is this kind of combination of Western evidence-based practices and then also the Eastern chakra levels. And the chakra levels that I'm referencing are the first six. There's 114 different chakras, but we typically talk about the first six that are along the spine. And so these were the examples that I provided before, kind of looking at what are the different kinds of stressors that might exist on these different levels. Last time that we met, or last podcast, we talked about level 2 and level 3. So the emotions, what kind of emotion, might be present and what that would look like and how to manage that or how to reduce it, and then different kinds of thoughts that might be present. and how to manage and reduce that. And, already have covered, the brain of the root and then the values and the third eye, which was that intuition, like a different way of knowing. This is like that you don't really have like a rational way of explaining it. You just kind of know something. So I want to go over like the level 4, which are physiological sensations, and the heart chakra, and then level 5, which is the throat chakra, but it also encompasses our behaviors and our environment. Um, and so this is what it kind of looks like, with all the different levels. And then so with the heart chakra, this happens to be probably my favorite chakra. I don't know why, it just is. I think I just like the word anahata, which is the level 4, which is the unstruck. Um, and when we think about something that is unstruck, the idea, what comes to my mind with this is that it is about like perception. So if you think about when people are afflicted with resentments or grief or pain, or some emotional or physical or stress, even, these demands that are placed on us, or threats or anything like that, there are going to be these like lingering pieces that affect how we see things. And what the 4th level is about is really this kind of, it encompasses these notions of compassion and acceptance and forgiveness. And when we look at that, from the perspective of our own perception, it helps to kind of understand that there is this kind of unstruck space, that affliction that we experienced with this demand or that resentment is not there. That anger is not there. It's kind of like a new freshness, a new way of seeing something that we haven't seen before, so to speak. And so these are some different ways of looking at it. And it's associated with physiological sensations because we oftentimes, when we get a physiological sensation, there is an automatic association with it. So many times people, and this is a brain thing because our brain loves shortcuts. This is why we develop habits. This is why habits are hard to break. And this is why it takes a lot of effort in the beginning to break a habit. But that once a habit is broken, that association is not as strong as it used to be. It's much easier to kind of go into something different. And, when I'm explaining kind of like how associations work, like I use this a lot with clients that I work with in the substance use field. These associations that people have in the brain with like the use of a substance and being activated to use. Like, oh, well, every time you see a certain person, you've always used with this person. So your brain is associating this person with using. The brain is going to take a shortcut with this. And so there's going to be this physiological sensation of, oh, image of person, activate, cue to use kind of a thing. And so there's this automatic association that occurs. And what happens here is that when we talk about this kind of physiological sensation as being different, the idea here is how do we shift that physiological sensation to be something different? How can we look at it to maybe perhaps give it a different meaning, a different interpretation, perceive it differently? And so it could be that rather than it based on past experiences that we've had, that we give it a space to make it a new experience. And so these are different ways that we could do this. One is cultivating patience. This is really about increasing distress tolerance. So our ability to tolerate distress can help with cultivating patience because it allows us a little bit more space to be able to see what else is possible. And that's not an easy thing to do. I mean, I know from just from my own experience, I am not a patient person. I know I have said this on many occasions. I do not have patience, and it is something I've had to cultivate and learn how to be patient more so than ever. And yet in that process of cultivating patience, I mean, it has definitely opened up a lot of different things. And so being able to just cultivate that patience, and this is about like being effective, just doing what you can in the space that you have, related to whatever it is that you are trying to accomplish. That's what patience is about. You're not, it's not about that instant gratification. It's not about your brain telling you, oh, we're going to do this right now. It's about delaying that, so to speak. Cultivating patience also is about increasing self-compassion. And I've talked about self-compassion before. Dr. Neff, Kristen Neff did a lot of research on this, and you could visit her website to get a lot of information about this. But she talks about, these concepts of, compassion that we would have for a friend who's going through a hard time, or kindness that we may demonstrate to a friend or a stranger when they're struggling with something, or just the recognition that we're human. And, these are things that we're going to experience. We're not like a robot. We're not some superhuman person that can, pick up the world and, just do whatever. We are human beings with human experiences. And because of that reason, we suffer. And so in that suffering, because it's such a normal experience, that we can recognize that we can have compassion to that. And so by cultivating that, by increasing that, it gives us a little bit more patience to recognize that, oh, yeah, what I'm going through right now is hard to deal with. And that's okay that it's going to take me an extra day to do X, Y, or Z. Maybe I don't need to get the laundry done today. I can, maybe tomorrow do that. I'm not going to force myself to do it today or demand it, because that's going to add more stress to already a stressed out, organism that you're experiencing. A ritual is something that you can also use to manage and reduce physiological sensations. There's really something cleansing about a ritual. And if you think about things that you may do, rituals are actually acts of deliberate, intentional, what's the word I'm looking for? It's just an intentional action that you do, and it has meaning to you. And it's a way to kind of clear a space for yourself and make it very intentional. It brings some sort of normalcy to something that may feel very chaotic. It brings some sort of deliberateness to things that feel out of control. And so developing some sort of ritual can be very helpful, like whether it be a morning routine or an evening routine or something in between. Those are all things that can be very helpful. I know that since I've been doing a morning ritual, I have a morning ritual that I do, and I've been doing it consistently for now the last almost 2 years, that it's been something that's really helped in times when I've had increased stress, and also when I've not had stress, but staying consistent with that has really been helpful with being able to, manage my symptoms, and also clear my perspective on things. Focusing is a technique. It's a psychological technique, which actually focuses specifically on physiological sensations. So it is something that you can go and research. I don't want to go too much into detail with it, but you're kind of like tuning into a bodily sensation. So you're really kind of digging deeper into what a particular physiological sensation may mean. Um, I've used this technique with clients like who have chronic pain, to see if there was additional information. I've talked about this before, how, trauma, for example, things that we go through that are significant, our mind may forget, because that's what the mind does. It is built to protect us. And so sometimes it will forget in order to protect us, but our body does not forget. And so sometimes physiological sensations may be like a means, a way of knowing some information that we may not have known before. And some of you may have had the experience, like if you're doing yoga, for example, you've heard this before, like people that do yoga, when they start to do hip poses or hip, routines, that they have some sort of an emotional experience with that. And that is because that emotional energy has been contained in their hips. And so when they are starting to move that and experience it differently, and those physiological sensations are moving around, it's releasing that energy. That's exactly what the focusing is about. Dr. Eugene Genlin is the one who originated this, and there is a focusing institute that exists where you can contact a person who specializes in this, who's trained in it, and who can actually walk through it. There's also a 6-step process that's online that you could do yourself too, to get kind of like an introductory idea to it. A body scan is another way of doing this too with physiological sensations. Most of you have probably experienced this or have done it, where you basically just kind of scan your body and see, what is going on. Oftentimes, just being able to find places where you're experiencing physiological sensations and where you're not. Finding some other space that is neutral or not tense can be a way to allow your perception to shift with that. And so it helps you kind of see something different, which can reduce the stress that you're experiencing. HALT, in the recovery world, they talk a lot about HALT, and recognize that these are very important physiological sensations that people experience. Hunger is a very real physiological signal. When you're hungry, because some of you, may have had to relearn this, but it is a very real bodily sensation that tells you that you need to eat. And sometimes what we do is we'll ignore it because we're either too busy or we have something else that's going on, or we can't stop and eat something, or whatever the case may be. And yet, the very act of delaying that, of not taking care of that physiological sensation increases the stress that we experience. And a lot of you, have mentioned this before, I've talked about this before, like, some of you have the experience that when you are hungry and you don't eat for a while, that you start getting irritable, or you start noticing that you get more emotional or more reactive. And that is because of this sense that this very basic need has not been met. And the moment that you feed it or feed yourself, that sensation decreases, the stress on your body decreases, you're fed, your body's getting the nutrients it needs. And so you're essentially reducing and managing that physiological stress. Angry is the other one, and anger again has its own physiological sensations. It's different for everybody. But the idea behind it is just recognizing what yours is and how does it manifest itself. Loneliness is a huge one. The pandemic, really, and I mentioned this before, how that was something that I experienced, pretty intensely too. And so it was very physiological too, and just recognizing what that looked like. And fatigue, oftentimes people will feel fatigue and not recognize that what they're experiencing is fatigue, that the body just needs to rest, even if it is like a 5-minute, just closing your eyes and not letting your brain be active. And sometimes the brain just needs to shut down. And it's not like going to sleep, because you're not sleeping. You are essentially just allowing the brain a break, so that it's not actively working as intensely as it was. And so that's really, managing some of that stress that it's experiencing. And then we have, the level 5, which is the throat chakra. And the throat chakra really is about communication and expression. And I really, look at it as kind of like your own core truth, so to speak, because it also kind of demonstrates and, represents what our behaviors are about, what our environment looks like, things that are, what we do for a living, the kinds of hobbies or activities that we engage in. Those are all ways that we express ourselves. So our communication skills, how do we communicate with other people? How do we communicate with ourselves? Being able to kind of examine that and look at it and find different ways of communicating more effectively can be helpful in managing and reducing some of these things. Expression, how do you express yourself? How are you expressing yourself through your work, through the activities that you choose in your environment? This is very important as well. Some people like to be more creative in their expression, but they don't do it. And so one way of, managing and reducing some of the stress that we experience is by allowing yourself to do that, because it's part of your expression chakra. That's how you communicate. And so if it's part of your nature, to suppress it actually then affects the energy in that chakra. What is your truth? This is like your core truth, and the part that cannot be escaped, the truth that cannot be escaped. So this is really kind of looking at things that show up consistently and looking at, what it is that's not being looked at. So what patterns come up? What messages come up for you consistently? What is it that keeps coming back to you? Um, and oftentimes there's some form of that relates to, well, something is not being communicated, or you're not communicating it, or it's not being communicated to you, or somehow something is trying to communicate to you about it. Your body might be trying to communicate it. Your stress might be trying to communicate it to you, to let you know what's going on with this. Uncluttering is another way that you can manage and reduce stress in this particular chakra, and then in the behaviors and in the environment. There's lots of research out there, evidence-based practices that talk about, reducing clutter, clearing the space, minimizing stuff, things like that. There's lots of different books that have been written about this, lots of different, models that people have utilized to reduce clutter, finding meaning in the chaos, or what kind of things that you keep, or even just looking at, how you organize things. There is a lot of different kind of catharses that happen for people when they start to really look at unburdening themselves with stuff. And then vocabulary is another thing that can be used here with managing and reducing. This, relates to communication, and it also relates to expression. And one way of doing this is just learning a new word every day, finding maybe a different word that you could use to express something that maybe you have not been able to express, or maybe in a different way, because oftentimes, words that we may use the same word to express something, but it doesn't have the same meaning to us. And so I use a thesaurus, and sometimes I'll say, that's kind of the same word that I want, but I mean, that's not really the word I'm looking for. So I'll go to a thesaurus and I'll look to see what kind of words come up, with a particular word. And usually I can find a different word that really resonates with what the experience is. And so finding a different word that really captures what you want to communicate can be a really great way to help you manage and reduce some of that stress, whatever symptoms that you're experiencing. It can help in your environment. It can help you just communicate and express what's happening for you, which in and of itself is part of this level of management and reduction. So that's the level 4 and the level 5 with the different stress strategies. And so you can also look online at my website to find more about those. So stress recovery. So the definition of stress I talked about, this is again just recognizing that there is adaptation, adjustment, accommodation, perceived or a real threat or demand. And when we talk about recovery, we're talking about returning to a normal state of health, mind, or strength. And so when we talk about stress recovery, we're talking about the process of the body returning to a normal state of health, mind, or strength. And whatever normal, and again, I use normal, loosely, because everybody's kind of homeostasis is very different. If you think about like homeostasis being this kind of continuum, right? This is what we're really looking at. So whenever we experience stress, I've talked about this before, it elicits this stress response. This is your sympathetic nervous system. It increases your heart rate, your blood pressure, chemicals, all this kind of stuff, right? To meet these demands, this threat, whatever it may be, the body becomes activated. And so when the threat subsides, the parasympathetic nervous system signals the brain that, oh, it's time to rest. We can stop that. All right. So the parasympathetic nervous system is our friend. We want to activate the parasympathetic nervous system when stress is, when the threat or the demand is kind of done. Because that deactivates the stress response. It stops these chemicals from being produced in our body. It decreases the heart rate. It decreases our blood pressure. Those are all positive things that we want. But what tends to happen for a lot of people is that you could see where this white arrow is, the point of recovery. Right when we're getting to this point of recovery, there's the pink. We have additional stressors that are being placed on us. It could be anything. It could be something we're thinking about. It could be a phone call we get. It could be something we see. It could be something we hear. But there's some external or internal thing that puts something else, another layer. So even before we have a chance of getting into that stress recovery, we've already added another stress response. And it's very subtle, by the way. This is not something that we are consciously aware of, because the automatic nervous system, it happens automatically. It is outside of our conscious control. Because if we were to consciously say, okay, heartbeat, 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 that is all we would be focusing on. We would not be able to go about our day. And so after a period of time, what happens when we have all these stressors that keep adding on and keep adding on, and we're not allowing ourselves to having this point of recovery, the body does respond. And some of you have experienced this where you have this kind of like second wind, so to speak, right? You have this like, oh, wow, I don't know where this energy came from. Like, I've just got this like second wind. Whoo-hoo, I'm going to like get all this other stuff done. Well, the body recognizes that, you're going through this kind of period where you need a little oomph. And so it mobilizes the resources in the body that it needs to in order to help you get through that. At the same time, it's also wanting a reciprocated relationship and saying, well, I'm expecting you to kind of take care of me too. And yet most of us never do that. And so what happens is that the body, it does have a limit. And so it breaks, quote unquote, down. This is when people experience exhaustion. They may have a breakdown, they may get sick, they may end up sleeping for like, 10, 12 hours because the body is just exhausted. You've exhausted the endocrine system, the adrenal glands, the way the body is able to function. And so if this continues over and over and over again, chronic stress, when people experience that, this is over a number of months, it can have a systemic effect on the body. There are what's called diseases of adaptation, stress-induced hyper blood pressure, hypertension, things of that nature. Those are all things that happen as a result of this. So this is why the stress recovery period is very important. And this is also why that what's important is about managing and reducing the stress that we are experiencing so that we have the opportunity to allow the body to get back to this kind of as close as possible to this normal state. So what can you do? Here are some things you can do for that. We've talked about breathing. We've talked about the basics. You want to basically put on the brakes. So being intentional with your attention, with your intention, going back to monitoring your just your temperature, your heartbeat, your breathing, all of these things can help you reduce those symptoms and put on the brakes to the stress response. And so once you do that and you allow your body that rest that it needs, that can even be when you're going through a stressful period of time, you get more rest so that the body has a chance to recover. This is why sleep is so important when people are going through stressful periods, because the body then has an opportunity to regenerate and to heal what it needs to. So that is the stress recovery. And it is a crucial step to healing and restoring, to reset, so to speak, itself. You know, hydration, all this other stuff is very important as well. And again, you don't need to add new things to an already demanding schedule. This is the thing about, you know, with stress, is that stress management, is that these are things that you can incorporate like in your already day-to-day life. These are not things that need to be put on a to-do list because most of you are already doing this. And so I hope that was helpful. I don't know if anybody has any questions or comments that they would like to share, but I did just want to give a minute for that, or maybe 30 seconds, because I know we're at the end.
Very useful session, Dr. Serena.
Oh, thank you. I hope that people found something helpful in there. All right. Well, thank you so much for attending. I hope you got something out of it. And again, if you do have any questions, let me know, and we will see you in 2 weeks where we'll start talking about Mental Health Awareness Month.